Canadian. So technical problems. So we're excited to have the Zorian Institute back this year. This is our second year partner. They've generously supported the two panels this afternoon, the first of which is collective and state violence in Turkey. So I just want to thank Greg Sarkeesian and Södertörn Waldron and all these Zorian people for being back here and being part of this. It's an important partnership. And as my colleague Anastasia said yesterday, we're both. Yesterday, so we got some of your alumni here, and so we're very excited to have you. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Sophie, so Sophie can tell you more about the Zorian Institute and the work that they're doing and the education program they brought to Arizona, and as well as part of the summer program, I imagine you're going to mention. So I will let you do all those words.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Tim. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel, Collective and State Violence in Turkey. My name is Sophie Waldron, and I am the Deputy Manager for the Zorian Institute, the sponsor for this panel. I would like to take a moment and thank ASU and the organizers of Genocide Awareness Week, especially Volker Benker, Timothy Langill, and Alex Alvarez for organizing this truly important event on genocide education and awareness. The Zorian Institute and its subsidiary, the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, is excited to be contributing to Genocide Awareness Week, again for the second year in a row. For those of you not familiar with the Zorian Institute, it is a registered not-for-profit charity with offices in Arlington, Massachusetts, Toronto, Canada, and Yerevan, Armenia. The Institute serves the cause of scholarship and public awareness on issues relating to genocide, human rights, and diaspora-homeland relations. This is done through the systematic continued research of scholars and specialists using a comparative and multidisciplinary approach to research in accordance with the highest academic standards, along with education and publications. So Turkey has gone through significant transformations over the last century, from the Ottoman Empire and the Young Turk era to the Republic of today, but throughout it has demonstrated troubling continuities in its encouragement and deployment of mass violence. In particular, the construction of a Muslim Turkish identity has been achieved in part by designating its minorities as internal enemies, at whom public hatred can be directed. The Institute's commission book, Collective and State Violence in Turkey, which I have a copy of here, this one here, provides a wide range of case studies and historiographical reflections on the alarming recurrence of such violence in Turkish history, as atrocities against ethnic religious groups, including Alevis, Armenians, Assyrians, Jews, Greeks, Kurds, and Yazidis, from the 19th century to today, have propelled the nation's very sense of itself. Now, I'm pleased to present authors of this book who are joining us for today's panel. Dr. Hamit Bozarslan, Director of Research at the École des Études en Sciences Sociales, or the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, and Dr. Ayşenur Korkmaz, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study, who will both be joining us virtually. And we also have Dr. David Gaunt, Professor Emeritus of History at the Center for Baltic and East European Studies at Södertörn University, who is joining us in person with the moderator of today's panel, Dr. Barlow der Mugrdechian, Professor of Armenian Studies at Fresno State University. Now, before I hand it over, I just want to let you know that you can purchase a copy of this book and other academic works by the Institute on our website. And we are currently running a special promotion to celebrate our attendance at Genocide Awareness Week by discounting the price of this book by 20%. So I'd like to thank you so much for joining us here today. And now I'm going to pass it over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much. I would like to also add my thanks to the Genocide Awareness Week organizers, to the Zorian Institute for sponsoring today's panel. We're talking about a very important issue, and the book, which has been mentioned already a couple times, Collective and State Violence in Turkey, is a new endeavor, and it's a very important endeavor because what it's doing is comparing state violence both spatially over time that is through the Ottoman Empire to the modern Turkish Republic, including the Kemalist period. But it's also taking a look at the different case studies. So the book is divided into 17 chapters. The first section deals with case studies dealing with events during the Ottoman Empire. The second deals with the events during the Republican period. And then the third section deals with thematic issues that kind of tie all of them together. So I think today, when we hear our three speakers, that I think what we can be doing is thinking about where their work intersects and how we can tie that all together and see where that pattern emerges and how it emerges, and also get into a critical discussion, I hope with all of you, to ask questions, to see where our speakers have come up with conclusions, or have they come up with conclusions. And really, it's very interesting because we're only looking at really Turkey, right? But I think this could be applied in other areas of the world as well. So I thank the Zorian Institute for putting this together. And I might mention, very importantly, that the two editors for this work, one is Ramon Kevorkian, who is one of the premier scholars in the field of Armenian genocide history, and Stepan Asturian, who just recently retired from the University of California at Berkeley, who has also written extensively on the question of Ottoman Turkey, the Armenians, violence, genocide. So let's listen to our speakers. We'll organize it in the following way. We're going to allot approximately 15 minutes, 20 minutes to each speaker. Please hold your questions. At the end of the three speakers, I'll open it up to questions. I may ask questions, but please try to keep it in the form of a question, and then whoever you'd like to address the question to, or as a panel, we can do that. And then we'll just have a good discussion about this very important topic. So who are we going to start with? Okay, well, I think we'll go in the order that we had them in the announcement. So we'll start with Dr. Hamit Bozarslan, who will be talking. Is he up there yet? He's going to be up in just a minute. Could switch to someone else, or you want me to just try it?
Thank you so much. So I can start anytime you want.
Okay,
But
so
the
we're
video
gonna
is
just switch
on.
up the order just until we get the technical issues solved. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker. It's Dr. David Gaunt. He was already introduced, but he's received his doctorate from Uppsala University. He's currently a professor emeritus in history, and he will be talking about the Assyrian case during the period of the Ottoman Empire. So, Dr. Gaunt.
So, hello, I'm just testing my microphone. Hi, everyone. I thank the Zorian Institute for bringing me here to this lovely place, and also the Seifel Center, who has hosted me here. I'm going to talk about a very small part of this book that we have here. We can send it around so people can actually see what it is. There is a link, a blank spot on the history of Turkey, the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey, which filled 100 years last year. And that is what happens after the war is over, after what we believe is the Armenian and Christian genocide has ended. And as the Republic of Turkey consolidates itself under their new leader, Kemal Atatürk. Atatürk, as you may remember from world history, is considered to be a rather clean person in relationship to the genocide. He was in Gallipoli, he was in the Suez, he was far from where massacres were occurring. However, it seems now that it is time to reconsider, reevaluate his role once the war is over in eliminating the last remnants of Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. I will be speaking mostly about Assyrians. This is something I know best from my own research. How clean is actually the new Republic of Turkey? So I'm going to draw a map on the board here. I hope it can be seen. Can you see that? That's Turkey. I hope. And here is Iran. And so Syria and Iraq. It's actually a bit bigger, isn't it? So, and if you were here yesterday, you could see from the maps where the core settlements of Assyrians were, and it goes sort of like this. And that's before the First World War and the genocide. And they're nicely living in places like the Hakkari Mountains. Over here in Iran, a very wealthy town known as Urmia, and northern Iraq, Syria. The problem is that they're not alone here. They have neighbors, and much bigger neighbors. This is the core of Assyria, is also the core of Kurdistan. And one of my colleagues, Levine, he has called this a zone of genocide because of the continual violence that is reoccurring massacres and violence going on in everyday life. This means that normal Assyrians must go around thinking of self-defense almost continually. Men have to be prepared to defend themselves. Women have to be on their guard that they're not kidnapped or abducted in any way. And this makes for a very difficult everyday life. I would call it a culture of violence that you get accustomed to. Now, this means that Assyrians usually had to ally themselves with Kurdish tribes. And Kurdish tribes would have Assyrian sections in them. This meant, of course, that Assyrians got used to being parts of Kurdish tribal warfare. They were good at it sometimes. They had a warrior culture. Their heroes were warriors. They're okay, I'm not going to say too much about that. There is a cultural difference between the Assyrian groups. It follows the Tigris River, sort of like that. So an Eastern group and a Western group, which with very different histories. Even the genocide is different. And I'll talk about the aftermath of the genocide being different in the East and the West. I've got too many pens. Now, if you remember Omar Bartov's talking 2 days ago about the way you can go with diplomacy, there are two ways he talked about. One being negotiation. I'm not sure I know how to spell it, but or resistance. I think I did that one. And these are the two different trajectories that the Eastern Assyrians and the Western Assyrians take. Now, I'm compressing a lot of history down into a billion cube. So the situation, war is over in 1918 in November. The core of the Assyrian settlement is no longer. Many people are pressed down into Bakuba in Iraq or around Kamishli in Syria. And this is pretty empty, no man's land for a while. I'll begin with the Western Assyrians. They mostly belong to the Syriac Orthodox Church, who attempted to negotiate their way after the war was over. The first thing they did was to count the number of dead that they had within their church. It was the only church that actually did a detailed count. They come up with 90,000 dead, which is a considerable number, perhaps half of the original population. And they presented this at the Paris Peace Treaty to the Allies. You can find their brochure almost everywhere. The diplomats collected. They insisted on following Woodrow Wilson's 14 points of self-determination for minorities in the Ottoman Empire. And they demanded, or they asked for their own country because of their losses and because of their need to be independent from the Turks. Now, this was the first phase of their negotiations. The Patriarch sent his closest man to Paris. He was the only one who could speak French, it turned out to be. And he went from one diplomat to the other, trying to explain who are the Assyrians, where they lived, how many they were, and what they believed in. And then he went to the next one and had to do the same sort of thing. And in the end, nothing turned out of these diplomatic relationships. So the Patriarch, thinking, what am I going to do now? I still have some people left in Turkey. The Turkish nationalisms during the time that we're speaking in Paris, they're gaining more and more control over Turkey. Well, he starts negotiating with the Turkish nationalists, meets with Kemal Atatürk, says something like that, we are Turks. We want to be Turkish citizens. We don't want to be a minority. This is very controversial within the Assyrian community today. Did he really need to say this? Shouldn't he have stood his ground harder? But he did that. This was part of his negotiation. Thing was, it didn't work anyway. In 1924, he is forced out of the country in ways that we don't really know too much about. It could be that he was just leaving the country and was told never to come back again, had to remove the patriarchy from Turkey and put it up in Syria again. At the same time that he is in exile, those Syrians who remained in what is now Turkey are forced to leave, or with a very short notice, told that they have to leave the country. They cannot take their property with them. You know what that means. and they have to sign a declaration that they're doing it of their own free will. I think the Armenians had the same situation at that time. So an ethnic cleansing of the last people remaining in the western part. The Eastern Assyrians, they're the warlike type. They are tribally organized. During the war, they have been forced out of Hakkari and joined the Russian army, naturally. So there were 2 brigades in the Russian army of Assyrians. They also joined the British army after the World War was over. They are in a place north of Baghdad called Bakuba. You've probably heard about that. They don't want to be in Iraq. They don't want to become Iraqi citizens. They want to go home, either to Hakkari or to Urmia. How am I doing for time? Okay, gotcha. So, and the British think it's pretty expensive to have all these people living in a refugee camp. So they agree to give weapons to a small army, about 5,000 people, to, in 1920, go back into, well, they're on their way to Urmia, but also through the Hakkari Mountains. And it becomes a fiasco. It should be a walk in the sun, but as soon as people get close to home, they go home. And they, in the end, you don't have your army left. And that is in 1920. That's the first attempt to come in. People start trickling back on their own. We could say that by 1924, there are a couple thousand Assyrian families living in Hakkari still. And then there is an event that turns everything upside down. A group of Assyrians capture the local governor who was out trying to collect taxes, injures some of his bodyguard. And the Turkish government reacts with disproportionate violence, assembles a very large army from various places, even an air force and artillery, and forces the Assyrians out in September of 1924. They are not allowed to come back ever again. This is interesting because there is a debate about where the border between Iraq and Turkey is to be drawn, according to the Treaty of Lausanne. There was a commission doing that at the very time that the Assyrians are coming down from the mountains, being forced out, destitute, suffering. When the commission makes its report about the refugee situation, İsmet İnönü, the Turkish foreign minister, says, that's pretty exaggerated. We couldn't have done that. So, 1925, almost all remaining Assyrians within Turkey have been removed. We could say it ethnically cleansed. The amount of violence was definitely less than it was during the genocide. The amount of chaos was much less than before. It was more of a surgical use of state-controlled, army-led violence. What was the lesson for the Turkish government was, 1, they could do this. 2, they could do it in front of the legal nations and in violation of the recently signed Treaty of Lausanne. And At the same time, you can say, okay, the Assyrians were not massacred in the extent that it was previously, but the amount of suffering was probably greater. The displacement, the poverty, and the need to rebuild a life in a hostile and unfriendly environment remained. So I thank you. So. There you go.
Thank you, Dr. Gaunt. Our next presenter will be Dr. Ayşenur Korkmaz. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, and her doctorate was from the University of Amsterdam. Her research and her chapter in the book deals with gender and the role of women and how women were the target of violence, and she will talk about that topic. So Dr. Korkmaz.
Thanks very much, Barlow. Thank you for inviting me. I want to thank Södertörn Institute and the Arizona State University.
Ayşenur, you're gonna have
for
to
inviting me.
put up your volume. Excuse me, to put up your volume if you can. A little bit
How
more.
is it now? I'm on my headphones, but earphones, but I'm not sure. I could also try it without the earphones. It's okay.
It's a little bit difficult to hear, right? Yeah, we need. Where is it coming? We'll try to solve that. Yeah.
Okay. It might be something computer related also.
Go ahead and speak again. Let's see how you're.
Can you hear me now?
Still very light.
Interesting. Okay. Apparently it sounds fine on Zoom. Some attendees have written some Q&A messages that it's all fine online.
Yes, it's good now, Ayşenur, so go ahead and you can begin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll talk about sexual violence in the Ottoman Empire, the late Ottoman period. This period that I will talk about predates the Armenian genocide. It particularly looks at the Hamidian massacres of 1894 and 96. These massacres were partly mobilized and committed by the Ottoman state, and partly it was carried out by ordinary Ottoman Muslims or Kurdish paramilitary groups. And significant amount of sexual violence was committed during this violence. The assaulters were mostly Ottoman soldiers, Kurdish tribesmen from the Hamidiya Light Cavalry Regiments, this militia paramilitary group that was formed by Sultan Abdülhamit II, and ordinary rural men. And the scope of the violence ranged from underreported cases of rape to incidents of abduction, many of which were followed by disputed marriages. And today I will talk about the particular cases of abduction that were then followed by marriages and religious conversions. And so I'm interested, well, I was actually, this was my MA project, and I happened to have the opportunity to publish this in the volume. Now I'm working on Soviet Armenia and Republic of Armenia, completely different era, completely different state. But back then I was very much interested in how the patterns of gender-based violence against Armenian women in an ethno-religious conflict, such as the Hamidian massacres, evolved. And I wanted to bring the case of sexual violence into a context where we could discuss state perceptions of female bodies and their understandings of demography, their understandings of identity and biopolitics. as well as policies of impunity that basically helped the perpetrators and also the massacres to be carried out at mass scale in terms of gendered violence. And in the article, in the book chapter, I built most of my work on archival sources. These were mostly Ottoman archival sources, but I also used British sessional papers and international media reports, as well as accounts of European and American missionaries. Before going into the patterns and causes of the sexual violence cases in the Hamidian period, I want to give a brief historical context for those who are not aware of another mass violence episode in the Ottoman Empire that predates the genocide. The Hamidian massacres began with a repression of an Armenian community, a peasant community in Sassoon. This is basically in the Ottoman East. If you have to think of the map that David placed on the board, basically a little northern part of Syria, southeastern part of the Ottoman Empire, by the border of Iran. And this was the place where most of the Ottoman Armenian communities living. And the massacres basically began with an uprising, as a response to an uprising that was put in place by the Armenian peasants in Sassoon and Ottoman Bitlis. And also it continued with the protests in Istanbul. And these uprisings were mostly about double taxation of Armenian peasants that were basically the type of money that were taken by Ottoman Kurds, who were the tribe leaders and the tax officers of their regions. So this then led to an immediate violent episode in the Ottoman Empire, resulting in over 100,000 deaths of Ottoman Armenians, orphaning around 30,000 children, and tens of thousands converting to Islam out of fear, while others became refugees in North America and Europe. One of the sites of the violence and the massacres was Armenian women's bodies. Several women experienced rape and other forms of sexual offense perpetrated by Kurdish tribesmen, Ottoman soldiers, or security forces such as gendarmes. The victims of sexual assault were forced to marry their abductors and convert to Islam upon being kidnapped. There are a lot of cases in the Ottoman archives that basically give similar accounts of this being the case. And one very striking one was noted by the Ottoman authorities in Sivas in November 1895. This was also reported by the British authorities, that hundreds of Armenian men killed basically families. They were killed by Ottoman army members in Sivas. And then another report was also following this particular report, that their women were carried off when they committed atrocities, upon which then marital conversion was exercised on all the abductees. So this marital conversion throughout the massacres being so much more accentuated than peacetime in the Ottoman Empire was an integral problem of the sexual violence that I am exploring. the state rhetoric about the forced marriages and abductions was that these allegations were made by Western powers and Western media, and they were not credible because Armenian women had consented to marry their Muslim husbands and converted to Islam. So I'm interested in how to explain the interface between sexual violence and religious conversion upon marriage during the Hamidian massacres. So how can we evaluate the government's justifications of sexual assault? And I tried to use a framework by Foucault to understand both the minds of the Hamidian government at large, and also the way that the perpetrators' own understandings were justified. So the Hamidian government basically had a biopolitical gaze towards the bodies, identities, and choices of Armenian women, and not only Armenian women, of course, women in general, and the bodies of their imperial subjects in general, but particularly at times of conflict, women's bodies and identities and their choices became an arena, possible places of change, possible places of conversion. So this placed them at the center of demographic strategies. Biopolitics is defined by Foucault as a form of power imposed on the lives of individuals in attempt to maximize, register, and control populations. Foucault argues that as population came to being regarded as a crucial resource for state power, modern and modernizing governments started to obtain information on birth rates, life expectancy, mortality, sexuality of their populations. So they then implemented regulations aimed at controlling the choices of their legal subjects, such as fertility programs and hygiene programs, marriage policies and abortion policies, etc. So this really fits well into that context of a modernizing empire trying to gain as much information possible from imperial subjects. The Hamidian biopolitics exercised control over women's bodies by marriage and fertility regulations. So the Hamidian government interfered with the reproductive choices of Muslim and non-Muslim women. Non-Muslim women were mainly targeted by pro-natalist policies and marriage bans. So we know that right before the massacres, for instance, Muslim women were banned from being married to Shia Iranian men, and they were also banned from basically aborting their children. Non-Muslim women, on the other hand, became central to religious exogamy, a matrimonial practice that placed them outside the bounds of their religion and severed their ties with their communities. Armenian women's practices of religious exogamy came to light in the Hamidian period, especially in the massacres. So as they became target of abductions and forced marriages, these non-consensual acts constituted a form of biopolitical intervention. So throughout the massacres, the government found ways to invalidate the sexual allegations. And it argued that Armenian women had consented to marry their Muslim husbands and converted to Islam willingly. So the intent here is really an important subject, as it is also within the study of genocide studies, within the field of genocide studies. But so religious marital conversion basically validated the disputed marriages and denied any coercion and represented Armenian women's choices or their abductions as an evidence of their consent to the marriages. In official correspondence, we often see a routine phrase that's being used to describe women who were reportedly abducted and forced into marriage. The girl who got married to a Muslim after the necessary procedure for conversion. So as if conversion and marriage, the two different legal in the Islamic law procedures, are somehow connected in the Hamidian period. For example, an Armenian woman in 1899 got married to an Ottoman soldier during the massacres, and she wanted to repudiate her husband, and she wanted to go back to her family 2 years later. And then upon her request, the governor of Van asserted that valid consent was given to the marriage because she had converted to Islam upon marrying. And so this meant that she was now a Muslim and she couldn't go back to her family. And if she wanted to go back to Christianity, then she would be committing apostasy. So this is a good example, in my opinion, for how the Ottoman government at the time perceived the act of conversion as a prerequisite of the marriages they have made or they had to make. But as I briefly said before, non-Muslim women's conversion to Islam did not always constitute a prerequisite for the validation of interfaith marriages in Ottoman Sharia. In the early modern period, according to legal Islamic school of Hanafism, which dominated the Ottoman jurisprudence, a non-Muslim woman could keep her Christian or Jewish faith, Jewish identity, while being married to a Muslim. So a lot of non-Muslim women were free to observe the principles of their religion while being married to their Muslim husbands. So they were not, marriage and conversion were not binding legal categories. But then from the beginning of the 19th century, this relatively tolerant attitude that granted non-Muslim women the freedom of their religion started changing, and it became much more collectivized and symbolically political. So mixed marriages started to be considered as taboos. Then conversion came into act, and it became an essential way for interfaith marriages to actually to disappear. What's worrisome, actually, to think about the Hamidian massacres was that several Armenian women requested the annulment of their marriages, and they wanted to revert back to Christianity immediately after the massacres. And we have a lot of patriarchate, like Armenian patriarchate reports, foreign consul reports, and some of these reports of foreign consuls and missionaries are also recorded in the Ottoman archive. They basically place grave concern about those who had not reached puberty, whose consent were obtained by force because they were not in Turkish, in Ottoman Turkish, we call this akıl bali. This hasn't reached puberty yet. This was a big issue. And the Ottoman administration appeared to be ostensibly protective of the Armenian convert women. So the reconversion was not allowed because the state then really considered these convert women who were married to Muslim men as a part of the Muslim identity, the Muslim population. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the right page here. So it's basically an important way to think about the Hamidian massacres, to look at how the government operated on everyday life, on issues like marriage, like conversion, things that are legal and yet could actually be very important for perceiving how Armenian women survived and did not survive, the certain mechanisms of violence in the Ottoman Empire. So that's one important aspect of the Hamidian massacres, in my opinion. And then the second thing I will briefly talk about is the lawlessness and impunity, and how that actually, when imbricated with perpetrators' sexual violence, helped other perpetrators to commit more. Often these sexual violence cases appeared in the Ottoman East, as I said. The tribal leaders had an immense power, authority, often abusing their authority in their regions, and this always included village plundering, excessive taxation, robbery of their of villagers who were basically somehow not from the tribe. So these could be also sometimes Muslim villagers. These could be Armenian villagers. In this particular case, we're looking at the Armenian villagers. And the sexual violence was also prevalent in this context, because whenever there were raids, they would always abduct Armenian women, especially during the massacres. So these types of crimes often went overlooked, and the ignorance, the selective ignorance, allowed the tribes to continue their private crimes without any repercussions. There is a very good case about this. It's quite narrated, famous case actually, but I find it really useful to illustrate. And that is the case of Musa Bey from Mutki in Ottoman Bitlis province. He was an extraordinarily well-known tribe leader from Bitlis, and his father was connected to the Armenian government, and he was appointed as a governor. His father was appointed as a governor to several districts in Bitlis. And Musa Bey abducted and raped a 15-year-old Armenian woman, an Armenian girl named Gulizar, from a nearby village. And he then forced the girl to become a Muslim and marry his brother. The threats that he posed to the girl prevented her from going to the authorities. And upon the complaints from Gulizar's family that were made to the central government in Istanbul, she basically managed to send out petitions and attract some attention to her case. And in November 1889, the government decided to summon Musa Bey to Istanbul in order to investigate the cases further at a public trial. And a lot of the foreign powers and media followed the litigation then. But in the end, the court took about maybe a month to listen to everybody, including Gulizar, and they managed to basically send Gulizar back to her home. So she converted back to Christianity, and she annulled her marriage with Musa Bey's brother also. But the court case acquitted Musa Bey on all the charges that were leveled against him. not only did he negotiate his crimes of banditry and sexual violence, but also he required legitimacy and sponsorship from the state, so much so that actually he had gotten more wealthy, and he had gotten so much more notorious. So this example of lawlessness and the impunity, the selective punitive measures against the Kurdish tribes actually shows the scale of sexual violence and how it increased during the Hamidian period, and especially the Hamidian massacres. I want to conclude by saying that I wanted to explore the patterns of sexual violence against Armenian women during the Hamidian massacres. I argued that this conflict was enacted somehow through the bodies of Armenian women by blurring the lines between consensual and forced marriage. The government exerted control over women's bodies and sexuality and marital behavior. They denied any coercion in Armenian women's marriages and presented their conversion to Islam as a proof of the validity of the forced marriages. I also wanted to show that the Hamidian government granted immense impunity to some perpetrators of sexual assaults, especially tribal leaders like Musa Bey, who enjoyed access to powerful positions in the Ottoman bureaucracy. And so this lawlessness and impunity then encouraged them to commit sexual offense without fear. And in other cases than Musa Bey's trial, everyday criminal activities of the Kurdish outlaws, such as murder, burglary, pillage, they all overlapped with the perpetration of sexual assault against Ottoman Armenian women. Thanks very much for listening to me. So I think Barlow spoke, but we didn't hear. There must be some problem with the audio.
Dr. Bozarslan, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes. Do you hear me?
We can hear you. Please go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Do you hear me? Okay. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, if you hear me, I will start right away. Thank you so much for the Zorian Institute. I am very pleased to be here today. I wanted to be in Arizona, but it was unfortunately impossible to make it. And just my greetings also Astorian and Kevorkian, who are two very good friends of mine. I don't know if they are there or not, but in any case, that was wonderful that they have published this book on. So one of the questions that we can ask is, how come that since so many years, so many decades, state violence continues in Turkey? That was not the case in many other places. Take Spain, take Italy, take Germany. In these countries, there were massive state violence, but the state violence stopped after a while. While as Hans Lucas 2022, 2023, there was the state violence has continued in Turkey. For this, probably we can mention a lot of factors. One of them was that the Tanzimat period has been considered as a period of liberalism. It has been well welcomed by the European powers. Thereafter, the Hamidian regime has not provoked so much reaction in Europe. In 1915, the European countries, they were well aware that the genocide was going on in Turkey as a world power or as a Middle Eastern power. 1939, 1945, Turkey was very close to Germany, and in 1945 that was the Cold War. And today, once again, one has the impression that to some extent Turkey has been integrated or reintegrated to the world politics. So I think that these factors, external factors, played a role in the continuation of the violence in Turkey. But there are probably also internal reasons, and I think that these internal reasons have to be studied in depth. We have not done it yet systematically, and I would say that among these internal reasons, one of the factors that we have to take into account is the impact of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism actually didn't start with Darwin, and it has survived to Darwin. Social Darwinism in the Ottoman Empire was well diffused, not under the Committee Union and Progress, but already when you take the Hamidian period, you see that a form of biological perception of the world has been well diffused. And in the Hamidian discourse, internal discourse, in the schools, in the military schools, but also in the diplomatic discourses, you see that the concept of the blood was already there. Blood, being of Muslim blood, being of the dirty blood, being of the polluted blood, that kind of concept they have were systematically used concerning the non-Muslims, namely the Armenians. Thereafter, when you take the Committee Union and Progress, many people thought that the Committee Union and Progress was a positivist committee, but actually when you see what the committee has said and what the committee has done, you see once again very clearly that the committee was a social Darwinist committee. The committee thought that there was a kind of juxtaposition between the space and the spices, that the Turkish spices have to occupy the Turkish spices, and that the examination of the non-Turkish communities, that was simply a right. When you take the Kemalism, once again, under the Kemalism, actually the official doctrine is not the revolution, certainly not the French Revolution. It is certainly not the social, the positivism. It is very clearly the social Darwinism. The Kurds are presented as a biological threat to the Turkish nation. The Turkish nation is defined as an ethno-class exploited and threatened by the Kurdish ethno-class. And actually, when you take the Erdoganist discourse today in Turkey, once again, you have this kind of biological arguments. And when you are in this kind of biological arguments, you will simply insist on the fact that Islam and the Turkishness are superior, and they have the right of the superiority. They are the strongest elements, and at the same time, they are threatened elements, threatened by the other communities, by the other ethnoclasses, by the Kurds, by the Armenians, by the Greeks, by the Western communities, whatever you can imagine. From Hamidianism today, you have clearly the idea that the Turkishness as a particular element is superior to the universal, and that the Turkishness has the right to dominate the space allotted or devoted to the Turkish nation. And I think that all these factors are quite important in order to understand why a state violence, which has nothing to do with the right, with the concept of the international right, with the concept of the justice, is going on. But this idea of the historical mission of the Turkishness can also lead to another kind of perception. In the Turkish historical reading, the Turkishness, the history of the Turkishness is divided into the three phases. The first phase, or the first stage, is the stage of innocence. The Turks are accepted as a community which received from the history, from the nature, and from God the mission of dominating the world. This mission is considered as a historical mission, as I said, but this mission is considered also as a mission to bringing to the world peace, administration, harmony. In order to accomplish this mission, the Turkishness has to be universal, but at the same time not dissolving itself in the universal entity. And this first stage has been followed by a second stage, which was the stage of betrayal. Betrayal of the external powers, of course. You call them imperialist, kuffar, unbelievers, whatever you can imagine, but betrayal also of internal communities, among them the Christian communities. And the third stage, the stage of the delivery, the deliverance, which has been realized partly, not totally, partly in during the War of Independence. And when you take such a perspective, in this perspective, extermination of the other communities becomes an absolutely normal thing, because these communities, they are considered as a betrayer, as the communities that have betrayed the Turkish nation, which brought them at once harmony, peace, the idea of state, the idea of administration, the idea of justice. In this perspective, there is absolutely no possibility to understand these communities as wishing to access to the citizenship, to the equality, to the liberty, because equality, liberty, or whatever you can imagine are attributed only to the Turkish nation. The other nations have to accept to be in a subordinated position. And in this perspective, the notion of responsibility does not exist. The actor, the Committee Union and Progress, can act, can destroy, can do whatever it wants, because it is wanted by the biological law, by social Darwinism, by the nature, by God, or whatever you can imagine. But this community, this actor, has not to accept any kind of responsibility. The responsibility is a part of the God. The God is responsible of whatever it happens. You are not responsible. There is no juridical responsibility at all. And there is no accountability at all. And in this perspective, the very notion of the right does not exist, because if you do act because you have a historical mission, because if you are charged by God to do whatever you want to do, or whatever you are obliged to do, In this case, the accountability is not yours. It is the accountability of God or of nature. And in such a perspective, what is very interesting to see is that the sovereign entity is not the state. The Turkish or the Ottoman or the Turkish Westphalian state is not a sovereign entity. The sovereign entity is the nation, the Turkish nation. When Erdogan decides to occupy part of the Rojava and transform parts of the Rojava into a jihadistan, the actor that acts is not the Turkish state, is the Turkish nation. The nation asks him to act in order to extend its biological rights over the borders of the state, over the borders of the recognized Westphalian recognized state. When Erdogan decides to act in the Karabakh, in the northern Karabakh, in this case too, what the instance that decides that Erdogan should act is not actually the Turkish state, but is the Turkish nation. And when you have such a picture, when you have such a situation, in this case, the Westphalian right, the international justice, the international law does not apply because you are not in international law, you are in the law or in a biological perspective of the spices acting against other spices. So the international law cannot have anything to say. So on one side, you have the God, you have God or whatever you can imagine, nation, nature that asks you to act, and on the other right, you are not obliged to apply the international law because you are acting in the name of your nation and not in the name of your sovereign state. And these perspectives create a lot of problems in Turkey, and it explains also why the state can act, I don't know even if one can say that if there is still a state in Turkey, or if there is a regime, but in any case, what is in stake is that that's not the state as an actor, international actor that acts, but that's rather the nation. And I think that that's one of the questions that we have in Turkey. And this political culture continues since many decades. When you take the Hamidian regime was absolutely not responsible, not an internationally acting regime, but that was a regime that clearly acted on the name of the Muslimhood, on the name of the Muslim blood. When you take the Committee Union Progress, once again, you didn't have a state acting and accepting the international law, what you call the Conseil des Nations of that period, but it acted as in the name and on the behalf of the Turkish nation, not taking into account in any way the notion of the international law. When you take Kemalism, and David Gaunt has already mentioned it, you sign a treaty called the Treaty of Lausanne, but at the same time, you are not at all obliged to respect this treaty because you are acting not on the name of or on the behalf of international law, but you act on the name or on behalf of the Turkish nation. And this policy has continued. The occupation of Cyprus, in the case of the occupation of Cyprus, that was not exactly the Turkish state. The Turkish state acted, but the Turkish state acted because the Turkish nation, the interest of the Turkish nation, asked or obliged the Turkish state to act. And it has continued until today in Rojava, in the northern Kurdistan, in southern Kurdistan, and in the Karabakh. And I think that until this political culture does not change, and until the moment where there is not a collective demand within the Turkish society to change its political culture, this policy of the state violence probably will continue. So I will stop here, and I will be very happy to answer to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bozarslan. I know we have just a few minutes, so if there are, I just want to open it up to the audience, and maybe we have online questions as well, so we can alternate. But if there's any, if there are any questions to any of our panelists, yeah, we can run the mic over. I'd like to start with Dr. Korkmaz. Can you hear me? I was wondering if you could, in your research of the Armenian massacres of 1895-96 and your research on the role of women and how the government viewed the women, is that something that comes from an earlier tradition that could be seen in earlier Ottoman tradition? Can you see that come up to that, or is that something new, something discontinuity, something new came up in 1895 in that period?
The marital conversions, so religious conversion upon marriage, was actually not like out of the blue during the massacres, but it had really accumulated, like it had gradually become the case. In the beginning of the Hamidian period, we see a great surge in conversions and a rather conflation between converting to Islam and getting married. But like, and even in the 1800s, actually, there isn't much that is discussed about this conflation. So we don't know exactly, but we know in the early modern period, there are accounts of women themselves or men or travelers or simply marriage records of cross community marriage records, basically citing conversion is not something that is like a required thing for marriage to happen. And also, this is very much in line with the Sharia in all Muslim countries, that a non-Muslim man can marry a Muslim man can marry a non-Muslim woman, and it hasn't been in practice in the Hamidian massacres for sure.
Is this better? Oh, yeah. Professor Gaunt, I just have a quick question. Do you know why the Assyrians were refused to have their own state or an autonomous region? In your research, did you find out the reason?
I mean, it is not really stated. They listened to the arguments. I think they were sort of bored because there were a lot of people who wanted their own country. And in the end, their imperialistic drive meant that they wanted to take over these places themselves. And that's about it. They were speaking to deaf ears. Some diplomats would say, yeah, we'll help you. And that led people on sort of, okay, we have a chance. But they really didn't.
This is an online question for Dr. Korkmaz. Was the religious conversion simultaneous with the marriage? Were the women forced to participate in the conversion process, or was this done without their consent?
Thanks, Robin, for this question. It's quite interesting, actually. So for conversion to happen or marriage to happen, women had to be present by law, by the Sharia law, in their community of witnesses. So whoever, both of the events, conversion required witnessing, and marriage required witnessing. And so it was actually they had to be there. But there were also cases like in the Ottoman archives that I read, like for instance, some women reported later, some girls reported later wanting to revert back to Christianity, citing that they were not there without their consent, they had been married. So these types of cases could also happen, I guess, like with the games that were put up by the men who were to abduct the women, and also the local imams and other officials who had to be present in those ceremonies. But necessarily, if they were, so they didn't have to be converting for being married, but then during the massacres, this was the case, so.
Okay, I guess we have time for one more question, a brief one.
So I'm curious, in a post-Erdogan Turkey, the national security state remains rapidly nationalistic in its recent history, and that probably will remain so after Erdogan's gone. I'm just trying to see if anyone could project how ethnic violence will continue after Erdogan, or maybe it will be tamped down.
Right, okay, futurology. Well, the content of this book shows that there's a continuity in how Turkey approaches its minorities, first the non-Muslim, and then now those who are Muslim, like Kurds and Alawi. And there is no reason why that would change, given the political makeup. It is not Erdogan himself only who has these policies. They've been around for a long time. And obviously, it seems that violence is part of the way you respond to political problems. Political, economic, and social problems are solved by violence. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but it's always there. So I don't see the preconditions for it to disappear, but I hate to be able to say that, yeah.
Well, thank you, Barlow. Would you like to close this one up?
Thank you to our speakers. I want to thank the Zorian Institute. I really highly recommend that you get the book if you're interested in this very important topic of collective violence, because I think it points to a way to see and analyze various governments, various states, and how they deal with applying violence towards their own citizens. So I think it's a good book for you to get. And I want to thank again the Genocide Awareness Committee, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.